Hi everyone, how are you doing today? This will be a pretty short and sweet commentary on chapters 10 through 16 of Wuthering Heights. I could really go quite a bit in depth here, but what I've found is that my reading pace has really slowed with this book, and the reviews keep getting longer and longer, and I just really wanted it to be the other way around. So gonna focus on two things in this part. I'm not gonna do a complete plot synopsis, but if you just kind of want the gist of it, and of course there will be spoilers here. So the first spoiler is Cathy and Heathcliff and Linton continue to clash. Cathy has this big breakdown both in her nerves and her physical health, and ultimately this leads to Cathy's death. I should also say that Heathcliff carries Isabella away. We don't really know to what extent it was consensual, but Isabella also marries Heathcliff and instantly regrets it. That's a lot of stuff that's happened in chapters 10 through 16, but the two things I really wanted to focus on are, well, ways in which Emily Brontë was very much, I think, ahead of her time and really expressed some ideas that have only more recently become common ways of thinking, I guess. So the first thing I wanted to talk about here was how Emily Brontë describes childhood trauma, and the way in particular she shows how something that happens in the present can recall something that happened in the past, especially something that happened when you were a child, something traumatic. So this is, let's see, this is in one of the clashes between Edgar and Heathcliff, and Cathy is talking about her distress when Edgar tries to separate her and Heathcliff. And when she's telling Nellie about this, she says, "I thought as I lay there with my head against that table leg and my eyes dimly discerning the grey square of the window, that I was enclosed in the old panelled bed at home, and my heart ached with some great grief which, just waking, I could not recollect. I pondered and worried myself to discover what it could be, and most strangely the whole last 7 years of my life grew a blank. I did not recall that they had been at all. I was a child, my father was just buried, and my misery arose from the separation that Hindley had ordered between me and Heathcliff. I was laid alone for the first time, and rousing from a dismal doze after a night of weeping, I lifted my hand to push the panels aside. It struck the tabletop. I swept it along the carpet, and then memory burst in. My late anguish was swallowed in a paroxysm of despair. I cannot say why I felt so wildly wretched. It must have been temporary derangement, for there is scarcely cause. But supposing at 12 years old I had been wrenched from the heights, and every early association, and my all in all as Heathcliff was at that time, and been converted at a stroke into Mrs. Linton, the lady of Thrushcross Grange, and the wife of a stranger, an exile and outcast thenceforth from what had been my world, you may fancy a glimpse of the abyss where I grovelled." So this is kind of coming after, again, Edgar trying to put some space between her and Heathcliff. And um, in her grief, in Cathy's grief, she's immediately transported back to when she was a child. And in that moment, Linton becomes Hindley. Linton becomes the evil force in her childhood that had separated Cathy from the only affection and companionship she had really known. And then she is associating that with being Mrs. Linton in the present. Now, of course, Cathy chose to become Mrs. Linton. She made that decision, but she feels powerless. She feels like she's trapped. She feels as if, Linton is every bit as evil as Hindley. And that's kind of what you might experience, if there's something traumatic that happened to you as a child. You can get into these situations as an adult where if that inner child gets triggered, then you might start to view things around you or people in your current life as being the perpetrators of your childhood. So Emily Brontë, obviously, there wasn't really a lot of discussion in the 1800s about childhood trauma and, all the modern theories about it and things that have been studied, but she's able to describe what happens here so clearly. And I just thought that was incredible, honestly. I just think she has this awareness of things that she's not even been taught. She just knows them. She sees them in life. Perhaps even experienced something like that herself. So that really grabbed me. And not entirely unrelated to this, but I wanted to talk about Cathy's choice. So Cathy chose to marry Linton, right? And she still feels like even after she's married that she's constantly choosing between Edgar and Heathcliff, but never loses this sense that she and Heathcliff are one, or they're somehow deeply connected to each other. And there was something in one of their arguments with Edgar that really jumped out at me, and I wanted to just touch on it here. So Edgar finds Cathy and Linton together, and Edgar is quite upset, but he is sort of ineffective. Like, he's not able to throw Heathcliff out of the house. You know, Heathcliff is this military man, presumably, or he's gone and done something in this space of time when he hasn't been around. He presumably has been in the military or done something else like that. He's a big guy. Edgar's not such a big guy. Edgar is weaker, physically. But also, I think there's a sense where Edgar might be like just having less initiative or less gumption, if you will. And it's kind of interesting because in this argument, when Edgar's being so weak, Cathy mocks him for it, and she says, "Your type is not a lamb; it's a sucking leveret." She's comparing him to, basically just the most pathetic of creatures. And even Heathcliff says, "I wish you the joy of the milk-blooded coward, Cathy." Very melodramatic. Heathcliff says, "I would not strike him with my fist, but I'd kick him with my foot and experience considerable satisfaction. Is he weeping, or is he going to faint for fear?" So both Cathy and Heathcliff, and remember, Cathy and Heathcliff consider themselves sort of this one person, they have this, connection. They're mocking Linton for being weak, and Linton ends up calling in some of his men to throw Heathcliff out, which is probably a smart thing to do, but Cathy and Heathcliff view this as weakness, and this got me thinking about Carl Jung. I've never read Jung, I should say. Everything I know about him is through other people who have told me about him. But I found this article, and I will link to it in the description. This writer is talking about Jung's theory of anima animus, so the unconscious feminine in men and the unconscious masculine in women. Anima is the feminine, animus is the masculine. And this writer is talking about how that plays out in romantic relationships. And so I just want to read this bit real quick that I think is a bit relevant to Cathy and what we're seeing here. So he says, okay, let's see. So he quotes Jung, and this is Jung. "The animus is a group of opinionated men, a band of fathers, brothers, teachers, judges." Now, when Jung is saying that, he means, where the animus comes from within a woman. Where does that masculinity come from? Or that idea, that image of masculinity, where does that come from in her? And so the writer of this article goes on to say, "Many women, especially those raised with strong father figures or societal expectations, internalize a form of the animus that becomes overbearing. She may reject tenderness, mistrust intimacy, pursue success at the expense of vulnerability. Yet, when the animus is integrated, he becomes an inner guide, a bridge to action, clarity, courage. Just as the anima inspires creativity in men, the animus brings inner strength and vision to women." Now, whether you believe in this anima-animus theory or you think it's all bunk, I think it's an interesting lens to view Wuthering Heights through. We've already talked about at length how Cathy views Heathcliff as herself and vice versa. So we can think of Heathcliff as like this, the more negative traits of masculinity, if you will, or these stereotypically masculine traits of violence, of strength, strength being a good thing, but you know, on the negatives, brutishness. And Hindley's kind of there too, right? You mentioned fathers or brothers. Hindley was a very strong influence in Cathy, and we saw in the previous episode how she imitated Hindley in so many ways. She became very violent towards people and had no control over herself, even when she most needed to. So, Heathcliff and Hindley forming this masculine influence in Catherine and what she comes to expect out of men. And in that passage we saw where Edgar is weak, she does not admire him for that. She doesn't appreciate it, and she doesn't like that. And so I think where I see Jung in this is that I don't think it's just Cathy comparing two men vying for her affections. I think Cathy is identifying with Heathcliff and identifying with the strength that Heathcliff has. And I say strength, I don't mean always in a positive sense. He was a bad dude, and misused his strength most of the time. But she identifies with that, and she rejects what you might call weakness, or especially in Victorian terms, this stereotypical femininity or effeminateness in Edgar. Again, we're using very stereotypical terms here, but this is, I think, the way that this scene is being set up, and the way Cathy, she's kind of disparaging her own femininity in a way. And we see how she disparages Isabella in various scenes in this book, and scorns Isabella for falling for Heathcliff, which I don't think is just jealousy. I think it's also this scorn of Isabella's womanly attraction to Heathcliff. I don't know how else to put it, but I guess what I'm saying here is that this struggle between Edgar and Heathcliff, or shall we say Heathcliff and Hindley, well, sometimes she sees Edgar as Hindley. Sometimes she sees Hindley and Heathcliff. Maybe there's a bit of fluidity going on here with the roles, but this back and forth between the strong and the weak, the power and the subjugated, the masculine and the feminine, I think that's what Cathy is grappling with. But before we simplify it too much, going back to that passage, which really I thought was so incredible. That one about the childhood trauma we read earlier. Cathy describes herself as the wife of a stranger, an exile, an outcast from what had been my world. So it's not just about these traits, even of herself. She's losing her world. She's losing her moors, her home. She's lost what she felt made herself her. And so it's really this existential crisis going on for Cathy. Now, as we see in chapter 16, she never lives to resolve this for herself or to really choose. She dies. But I think that this struggle is so fascinating. It's so much bigger than just a love triangle. And I think it shows how Emily Brontë was looking at these things in such complex ways, and not just not just a melodramatic gothic tale, although it is that too, but there's these other layers we can explore, and things that she's hinting at that maybe she herself didn't fully understand, but she saw the indications of these ideas. So yeah, thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts. If you have any supplementary reading you'd recommend on these topics, let me know. If you think I'm way off base, let me know. Let's have a discussion. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.